Hey, it's Travis from the Bar Banter Podcast, where friends, drinks, and dumb debates collide. Ever argue, what's the best cereal milk? Or, could you fight 100 duck-sized horses? How about, is Die Hard a Christmas movie? Spoiler alert, we're still fighting about that one. New episodes drop every Wednesday because your midweek needs more chaos. Find us on YouTube, Instagram, and all your favorite podcast apps. Be sure to hit the link tree at _Bar Banter Podcast. And when you do join us, be prepared to grab a drink, take a side, and banter responsibly.
The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Mary Jane Kelly's body was found in her lodgings at 13 Miller Court, Dorset Street, on Friday, 9 November 1888. It was a morning of great police activity in London, as it was the day of the Lord Mayor's parade, when crowds would be out to cheer the new mayor, and then 2,000 people would be given a free substantial meat tea, followed by entertainment. Many of the unfortunates of the area were looking forward to earning money from the men enjoying the holiday mood. But the festivities were eclipsed as news of another murder spread through the East End. From Naming Jack the Ripper by Russell Edwards. Well, welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is episode 129, part 3, 2ndCast, on Russell Edwards' book, Naming Jack the Ripper, The Definitive Reveal. The 5 by Hallie Rubenhold on the lives of the women killed by Jack the Ripper, and Robert House's book, Jack the Ripper and the Case for Scotland Yard's Prime Suspect. I also read London's Black Museum files on Jack the Ripper. My complete list of sources are on my blog, June 2025, at www.murdershelfbookclub.com. I hope you have enjoyed the series of special interviews that I've released, in addition to my usual schedule, Tony Wright and the Yuba County 5, and Wildlife CSI with the amazing Cheryl McCollum, and there will be more. It does not stop there. Look for me at Creators Row at CrimeCon Denver, September 5th to 7th, 2025. If you need a badge, you can save 10% by using my code, all lowercase letters, and one word, Murder Shelf, at www.crimecon.com/CC25. And it's getting closer. We had such fun the last 2 years, and I think this is going to be the best year. And a special thank you to my murder bookies, Marlene, baker of the most amazing sourdough breads, and Alicia, the incredible artist, for their support. I see you as you hear me. Now, this is 2ndCast, part 3 of my trilogy, so you have to listen to episode 123 and 127 before this one. Do not miss these previous 2 episodes that focus on Mary Ann Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, then Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, plus the crime scene and investigations. And now I'll begin part 5 of the 5. Mary Jane, born in 1863 and died on November 9th, 1888. In the 1870s, London experienced a crackdown on immorality and vice, which led to the closure of brothels, as well as establishments like the Haymarket and the Argyle Rooms and the Piccadilly night houses. As a result, discreet, wealthy gentlemen began attending invitation-only private balls, where the venue, band, supper, and purchase of women were all covered by the cost of admission. After some dancing and a few drinks, genteel conversation often gave way to bawdy language, with couples departing in carriages to continue their liaisons in private. Amidst this atmosphere, in 1882-1883, Mary Jane Kelly arrived in London, weaving a tale about her past that blurred the lines between truth and fiction. At age 25, Mary Jane was a striking beauty, with crystal blue eyes and a luxurious head of hair. She was possibly born in Limerick, Ireland, around 1863, into a large family of 9 children. One of her siblings, whom she called John II, served in the 2nd Battalion of the Scots Guard. Their father, John, moved the family to Wales when Mary Jane was a child, and at 16, she married a coal miner named Davis or Davies, who tragically died in a pit explosion a few years later. Widowed and living in Cardiff, Mary Jane was likely introduced to prostitution by a cousin and later moved to a very discreet upscale brothel on London's West End. Her origins are unclear. Some believe she was Welsh, others Irish, and there were claims that she had a 2-year-old child, but none of this has been verified. Now, after her death, no family recognized her name, Mary Jane Kelly, and searches for a brother in the Scots Guard or anyone named Davies or Davis found no leads. There is no census or parish records to confirm her identity, suggesting that her name may have been fabricated. Also, she carried no regional accent that might identify her as Irish or Welsh or otherwise. She had once claimed her father was a gaffer, which was holding a high position at the ironworks. Well, perhaps her father was an owner or a manager. Since no marriage record was ever found, it is also possible she was a mistress to a man bearing his child in the 1880s, which coincides with her admission to an infirmary in Cardiff, which lasted 8 to 9 months. Now, this situation would be highly unusual for a public hospital, but not for a private institution, asylum, or rehabilitation center for so-called fallen women. Now, in Cardiff, there were 2 possible places: the Protestant House of Mercy and the Catholic Convent of the Good Shepherd, both of which took in young women in their teens or 20s who needed rehabilitation from their immoral behavior. Higher-class families tended to view sex outside marriage as a mental disorder and often sent such girls to the United Counties Lunatic Asylum in Carmarthen, which Mary Jane had mentioned living as a girl, but we can only speculate, trying to connect these vague dots. Well, in the 19th century, moving to London was not taken lightly, especially for a single woman. Most would typically have a job lined up through family connections. It was challenging for newcomers to arrive, let alone immediately enter into the middle or upper ranks of the sex trade, dominated by those in the right circles. It's likely that Mary Jane was given the name of a landlady or a madam who helped arrange her lodgings in the East End, on streets like Knightsbridge or Brompton, housing army officers' mistresses, actresses, and artists, pseudonyms for those who catered to aristocratic politicians, wealthy individuals, and perhaps even the royal family. Mary Jeffries was an actress running a high-class establishment disguised as a dress shop. When a gentleman showed interest, Miss Jeffries would invite him to visit and, quote, try on her gloves, end quote, suggesting the availability of her beautiful employees. Meetings happened at various venues, and dinners would often include oysters, deviled kidneys, and roast beef served with champagne. Intimacy typically took place at a discreet hotel or one of the shop girls' rooms. The encounter might also begin at a theater, at the races, or a music hall, with a fee of £5 paid up front. The men, quote, seemed of a good class, while the women were cheerful, pleasant-looking girls of quite fair breeding and of a far better taste in their dress than the honest wives and sweethearts of the mechanics and shopkeepers, end quote. The high-class prostitute would stroll across the street and hike her skirts a bit too high when navigating curves. She would window shop, and she would look to see if a gentleman's gait slowed as he approached. Mixed into the crowd were ordinary shop clerks and servants running daily errands, making it difficult for potential clients to tell who was a prostitute and who was a respectable woman. At the peak of her career, in her mid-20s, Mary Jane was making a good living, enjoying the races and fine dinners while accepting gifts from her admirers. Eager to secure her future before her looks faded, she accepted an invitation from a wealthy man to travel with him to Paris. She arranged for a madam to send her trunk ahead, but it never arrived, which suggests she may have been duped into a sex trafficking scheme. Well, if it is true that Mary Jane had some education, she may have known enough French to escape the situation, returning to London from Boulogne. Now, this debacle would leave its mark, as she would never return to the high-end, luxurious west side of the city, with this continuing to haunt Mary Jane, altering the remainder of her life. Leaving the dock that day, Mary Jane would make her way to Radcliffe Highway, a grim road near the Tower of London that led to the city center, an area that catered to ships and their seamen. This area featured cheap housing, pubs, music halls, and opium dens where sailors sought sex. In search of a room, Mary approached the widowed Elizabeth Beaucou, whose late husband, a gas fitter by trade, had made a great living at buying properties and renting rooms to prostitutes. It is likely that Mary Jane feared her traffickers might be pursuing her, and now she discarded her Welsh identity and adopted the common surname of Kelly to protect her anonymity. Smart move, very smart move. Acquiring a room, Mary Jane began to ply her trade, far removed from her former elegance, now centering around the ebb and flow of ships arriving at port. The smoky, nautical-themed pubs were filled with women in revealing outfits, attracting men who often drank heavily and became violent on occasion. Drinking to numb the realities of their existence was a given, though some tried to stay sober to ensure their safety. Possibly due to her experiences while in France, Mary Jane's drinking worsened, causing her to leave Mrs. Beaucou's. Now Mary Jane rented a room from the McCarthys, who ran an unlicensed pub. Occasionally, she would go on a drunken rant, which they tolerated as long as she paid her rent. After she tried to retrieve her missing clothing trunk, a man claiming to be her father began inquiring about her. This caused her a lot of anxiety as she sought to avoid him, and it's suspected he was likely connected to the French calamity. During the coroner's inquest, her acquaintances confirmed that she had been disowned by her family and had no contact with them, so this man was certainly not her father. Perhaps it was this incident that led Mary to start considering her future in late 1886 or early 1887. Pretty and sexually alluring, Mary Jane had no shortage of admirers, and she had a number of regular clients, and one fell madly in love with her. Joseph Fleming, a 27-year-old plasterer who was financially secure, asked her to marry him. Mary Jane also felt strongly about Joseph, and they lived together in a furnished room for a time, but they never made it to the altar. Their relationship finally fell apart. A friend of Mary Jane's, Julia Venturney, suggested that Fleming had been abusive towards her. Now avoiding Ratcliffe Highway and Joseph Fleming, a neatly attired Mary Jane now frequented Commercial Street near Aldgate. Quote, "She was one of the smartest, nicest-looking women in the neighborhood," end quote, a missionary would say to the Evening News. Likeable, Mary Jane would sing and tell stories of living like a lady traveling to Paris. But to her 20-year-old neighbor, Lizzie Albrook, Mary Jane spoke the truth. Quote, "She was heartily sick of the life that she was leading." End quote. In March 1887, 29-year-old Joseph Barnett burst into Mary Jane's life just as she sought a more stable situation. In love with her, Joseph convinced her to move into his room on George Street. Barnett, a fish porter, earned a good living, but both of them struggled with alcohol, which was draining his wages. They moved 4 times, finally settling into a single room in Miller's Court a year later, in March 1888. The conditions were dark and squalid, with a bullying landlord who exploited his tenants. After losing his job, likely due to alcoholism, Joseph faced mounting debts, and by that November, they were 6 weeks behind on rent, owing 29 shillings, and Mary Jane had to return to solicitation after an 18-month break. Mary Jane argued fiercely with Joseph, feeling that he had failed her. During a heated exchange, the window was broken, with them stuffing it with cloth to block out the cold. Though unashamed of her past, Mary Jane knew Joseph preferred not to be reminded of it, especially when she brought home friends who were prostitutes. He would later say, quote, "She was good-hearted and did not like to refuse them shelter on a cold, bitter night." End quote. Reading about the Ripper murders in the papers, Mary Jane told Joseph she was worried, and now she was even further committed to offer her friends a room so they didn't have to sleep in the rough. Maria Harvey, a laundress and casual prostitute, was invited in by Mary Jane, and this was the last straw for Barnett. He moved out on October 30th, taking his own room on New Road. Barnett would continue to check on Mary Jane, for whom he cared deeply, hoping that they could be reconciled. The next day was October 31st, 1888. Princess Victoria and Princess Mary Adelaide visited the East End for the opening of the King Edward Institute and School on Hanbury Street, which was festively decorated. Notably, there had been no new gas lease layings for a month. Guy Fawkes Day was celebrated on November 5th, with crowds enjoying effigies of Fawkes and Jack the Ripper. And anticipation was building for the Lord Mayor's Day Parade on Friday, November 9th. Around 7:30 p.m. on November 8th, Joseph Barnett came to Mary Jane's room. She was outside chatting with her friend, Lizzie Albrook, who had just come back from the 10 Bells pub, where they had happily chatted with Elizabeth Forster. Mary Jane and Joseph spoke for about an hour, during which he apologized for not having money to share and expressed regret for their breakup. Neighbor Mary Ann Cox reported seeing Mary Jane and a man approaching Miller's Court around 11:45 p.m., with Mary Jane singing, "A Violet Plucked from My Mother's Grave." I have linked this song from the Jack the Ripper Museum on my blog, so check it out. Mary Jane was heard singing again around 1 a.m. as it began to rain. Elizabeth Pratt, who lived upstairs, noted that after 1:30 a.m., Mary Jane's side of the wall was silent. At some point in the early hours of November 9th, Mary Jane went to sleep, removing and folding her clothes on a chair before snuffing out the candle. Mary Jane's friend, Catherine Pickett, visited her room around 7:30 a.m. the morning of November 9th to borrow a shawl. When there was no answer, she went about her business. Landlord John McCarthy sent his worker, Thomas Boyer, to collect rent from Mary, who, like I said, was 29 shillings overdue. When Mary didn't respond, Boyer reached through the broken window to pull back a curtain and was horrified to find 2 lumps of flesh on the table and a body on the bed with blood on the floor. He quickly returned to McCarthy, who confirmed the murder and sent Boyer to fetch the police. On Commercial Street, Detective Constable Walter Drew and Inspector Walter Beck saw the terrified man approaching. Quote, "Another one! Jack the Ripper! Awful!" End quote. Beck summoned Dr. George Baxter Phillips and sent a telegram to Scotland Yard. Miller's court was sealed off to preserve the crime scene. Inspector Abilene arrived at 11:30 a.m., and at 1:20 p.m., Superintendent Arnold arrived, ordering the police to break in, revealing Jack the Ripper's magnum opus. Mary Jane Kelly was savagely mutilated. Skin removed so completely, a skeleton was revealed, and one couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman on the bed. On her back, legs spread wide, she was eviscerated, her breasts removed, one tucked under her head. Her intestines were by her left side, her liver between her feet. On the table were large flaps of skin and muscle removed from her abdomen, and her face had been mutilated beyond recognition. A photo does exist, but it does not do justice to the carnage. A large fire had burned in the fireplace, and the ash was still warm, and it is likely the killer lit this to be able to see, because the only other light source was that single candle. This makes me think that he inflicted all this damage on her while naked. It would have been nice and warm in that little room. And naked, none of his clothing would show blood spatter, nor would Mary Jane find it odd when he stripped down. The public was crowded together watching the Lord Mayor's parade when they learned of the horrific murder, their cheers ceasing abruptly. As the body was removed, a crowd gathered, being held back by police lines. Men removed their caps in respect as the cart carried the remains to Shoreditch Mortuary. Her room was boarded up and padlocked. It was determined that death had come from a severed carotid artery, the neck cut deep into the spine's vertebrae. There were so many slashes to her throat that they couldn't all be counted. The coroner's inquest into the murder was held quickly, with Dr. George Baxter Phillips muting his descriptions of the extensive injuries suffered by Mary Jane Kelly. Her funeral took place on November 19th, with a large number of attendees who were deeply affected by the tragic loss of this young woman. She was buried at St. Patrick Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone with no family present. Mr. H. Wilson, the sexton of St. Leonard's Church in Shoreditch, compassionately covered the funeral expenses. Despite their efforts, the investigation into Jack the Ripper yielded little progress. The day before Mary Jane's murder, Sir Charles Warren had resigned as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Force and was replaced by Commissioner James Monroe. Other murders and crimes occurred, triggering other investigations, but they did not match the throat-slashing mutilation known to be Jack the Ripper's modus operandi. By January 1889, Monroe canceled the additional plainclothes officers in Whitechapel, and Inspector Abilene returned to Scotland Yard, taking on other cases. And the unsolved mysterious case of Jack the Ripper passed into history. Hallie Rubenhold passionately concludes that working-class women like Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane faced significant challenges from the start, with their gender adding to their burdens. As you have heard, women were often limited to low-paying jobs, receiving little education, and were expected to be wives and mothers, in that order, supporting their families. And despite being literate, Polly, Kate, and Mary Jane had no opportunities for office work. If a male provider died, these women struggled to survive as they were seen by Victorian society as expendable. Add the lack of access to birth control knowledge, perpetuated poverty, and they endured harsh moral judgments from the Victorian middle and upper classes. In 1888, the belief that Jack the Ripper targeted prostitutes reinforced the public's moral condemnation of these fallen women. However, there is no evidence that Polly, Annie, or Kate were prostitutes. Elizabeth Stride was, at the most, a casual prostitute, rejecting the profession in earnest and only possibly returning to it just before her death. During the police inquests, no witnesses claimed any of these women had solicited them on the nights they were killed. Their death certificates list them as wives, widows, or single women, with only Mary Jane Kelly admitting to involvement in the sex trade. These murders shocked the nation and were only made slightly more palatable because the public believed only prostitutes were being targeted and that other decent women were safe. This myth dehumanizes the victims, which only fueled Jack's misogynistic views. It is crucial to reject this narrative and recognize the truth by reading Hallie Rubenhold's book, because it is a masterpiece. Now, this leads us to the significant question: who was Jack the Ripper? So, for the 100th anniversary of the Whitechapel murders, FBI agents John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood developed a profile of this serial killer. They concluded that the murders were committed by a nocturnal, insecure individual who operated within his comfort zone, meaning an area he knew well, Whitechapel. The killer was act-focused, launching blitz attacks that quickly overpowered his victims. He likely strangled them before cutting their throats with a sharp knife, killing very quickly. While he was required to have some physical strength, his main advantage was the element of surprise. He didn't look like Jack the Ripper. Fueled by a deep hatred of women, John Douglas referenced Dr. Phillips' testimony during the Annie Chapman inquest, which indicated that 3 of her personal items were carefully positioned around her body. Now, this kind of detail is often associated with psychotic killers and suggests that Jack the Ripper may have been psychotic or schizophrenic. This also reminded me of killer Carmine Calabro, who murdered Francine Elverson in New York City in 1979. When the kind, shy elementary school teacher's body was discovered, she had been beaten badly, with her underpants pulled over her head, covering her face. There were bite marks on her thighs and knees, and she had been repeatedly cut with a penknife. An umbrella and pen were forced into her vagina, and her earrings were symmetrically placed next to her ears. This bears a striking similarity to Annie Chapman's case. Now, Carmine Calabro suffered from serious mental disorders, and he had snuck out of the hospital where he was being treated the day he killed her. Well, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for her murder. Now, the Ripper also reminds me of vampire serial killer Richard Trenton Chase, a schizophrenic serial killer who eviscerated his random victims and then used a blender to drink their blood. The crime scenes were horrific beyond imagination. Now, back in Whitechapel, Jack the Ripper mutilated the bodies and faces, seeking to obliterate the women's identities in a deliberate, ritualistic fashion. Well, did he know them? I believe he lived in the area, and he may have seen the women, but no, they were not formally acquainted, in my opinion. He had little or to no contact with women besides family members. Now, similar to Richard Trenton Chase and Carmine Calabro killers, these murders exhibited a lack of planning, indicating that Jack was a disorganized killer. He wasn't able to engage in his signature activity with Marianne Polly Nichols, as she was neither mutilated nor missing organs. While I believe this is an early attempt at fulfilling his murder-fueled fantasy, this may not have been his first attempt. In the case of Elizabeth Stride, I believe he was interrupted by Louis Dime Schultz, and that the double event involves a single perpetrator. We can see in the cases of Kate Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly that he escalated his violence by mutilating their faces. When given all the private time he wanted with Mary Jane, he decimates her body. Jack harbors bizarre thoughts about the human body, taking organs as souvenirs. His focus on the genitalia indicates a lust murder, which does not mean he's a sex maniac. Instead, he is acting out his hate, targeting the vagina, breasts, and uterus, the very symbols of femaleness. With schizophrenia often emerging in males in their early to mid-20s, the eyewitness descriptions of Jack the Ripper's age falls within this time frame. Now, schizophrenia is a chronic mental disorder that affects the thoughts and perceptions of reality. Symptoms include hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized speech known as word salad. In paranoid schizophrenia, individuals may feel persecuted and believe that they are being hunted or poisoned. Violent behavior is rare, occurring in fewer than 10% of these cases. FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood believed that although he appears normal, this murderer wears different clothes as he trolls for his victim. And as I said, I believe he killed Mary Jane Kelly while naked, redressing in pristine clothes and departing after executing his fantasy en toto. Profilers write that Jack's mother was domineering and his father weak or absent, which may have led to his emotional withdrawal and asocial behavior. Statistics indicate that in his youth, Jack probably set fires and tortured animals, channeling some of his rage outwardly while much remained inward. Any writing he did would have reflected his inner turmoil, illogical, disjointed self-loathing, and violent fantasies, especially towards women. He may have worked as an assistant to a butcher or perhaps a barber and carried a knife for self-defense. Having never married, he roamed Whitechapel, awaiting for the right moment to kill, and likely visited the burial sites of his victims. Now, in Jack the Ripper and the case for Scotland Yard's prime suspect, Robert House discusses suspects that have been identified by the authorities, though I will only focus on a few. The Sun reported at the time that Sir Melvin Macnaughton, the Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, claimed to know the identity of the perpetrator. In a police memorandum, Macnaughton identified three main suspects. 1. Mr. M.J. Druitt, a 31-year-old doctor from a respectable family. Druitt had vanished at around the time that Mary Jane was killed in her room. He had been dismissed from several jobs due to, quote, serious trouble, end quote. A month later, his body was found floating in the Thames, and Constable George Molson, who inspected the body, found large rocks in his pockets, along with some money, gloves, and a train ticket. Macnaughton suggests that Druitt may have been, quote, sexually insane, end quote. 2. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew from Whitechapel. Kosminski suffered from schizophrenia and had a known dislike for women, especially prostitutes. He was committed to a lunatic asylum in March 1889 and died at the age of 56. And 3. Michael Ostrog, a Russian with a substantial criminal record. Ostrog was considered to be a homicidal maniac. However, his whereabouts during the murders were unclear. Ostrog was 5'11" tall and 55 years old at the time, making him too tall and too old to be the perpetrator of this series of murders. Now, among these suspects, Aaron Kosminski has gained significant attention in recent years due to recent DNA analysis. For a detailed exploration into this investigation, I recommend reading Naming Jack the Ripper by Russell Edwards, the book I opened with. The book provides a thorough step-by-step account of Edwards' exhaustive, decades-long investigation from multiple perspectives. Russell Edwards purchased a shawl associated with the victim, Catherine Eddowes. Now, according to the story, the shawl was found at the crime scene by Sergeant Amos Simpson of the London Metropolitan Police. Believing it to be of good quality and noting its attractive Michaelmas daisy pattern, Simpson removed the shawl from the scene, thinking that his wife, a dressmaker, could use it. Now that sounds terrible, but keep in mind there was no forensics to be used on the shawl in 1888, and although it's never a great idea to remove evidence from the crime scene, he did. Simpson's descendants have provided affidavits confirming his involvement in the Eddowes murder case, stating that he was one of the first officers to arrive at the scene and discovered her body. The shawl has since been passed down through his family as a cherished historical heirloom. And I find the connection between the shawl and the murder scene to be compelling, although others have differing opinions, which is perfectly fine. Now, the DNA analysis presents a challenge, particularly when you're working with 130-year-old samples. Russell Edwards enlisted the help of Dr. Jari Luhalanian, a biochemist at Liverpool's John Moores University, who collaborated with Dr. David Miller, a molecular sperm expert from the University of Leeds. Both institutions have established outstanding reputations in their respective fields. Their analysis was peer-reviewed and published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, which helped establish the credibility of their findings. Stains on the shawl were identified as human blood, quote, consistent with an arterial blood spatter caused by slashing at medium velocity, end quote, which aligns with Jack the Ripper's MO. They also discovered epithelial cells on the shawl, which are typically found lining organs such as the lungs, the gastrointestinal tract, reproductive, and urinary tracts. Luhalanian speculates that these epithelial cells may have originated from the urethra during ejaculation. It is important to note that this refers to tissue and not sperm, although sperm heads were indeed found on the shawl, as noted by Dr. Miller. Additionally, a large stain in the center of the shawl showed evidence of various bodily fluids, suggesting the presence of severed body parts, indicating dismemberment. This is consistent with the injury sustained by Catherine Eddowes, who had her uterus and one kidney removed. While scientific testing continued for years, Russell Edwards also conducted research on the origins of the shawl, paying close attention to its material, construction, and type of dyes. The shawl was made of high-quality silk, which leads me to wonder why Catherine Eddowes, who was impoverished and often homeless, would keep such a valuable item. Wouldn't she have pawned it? Well, I think without doubt she would have, and I'll return to this point later. Spitalfields, located in Whitechapel, was the center of the silk industry in England dating back to the 1600s. Although power looms replaced handcrafting during the Industrial Revolution, weavers would continue to produce these goods until the 1880s. Research by Russell Edwards revealed that Spitalfields silk designs typically featured an open floral pattern, which were quite different from the tightly packed Michaelmas daisies found on the scarf in question. The textile department at Sotheby's identified the shawl as being made in the late 1800s, suggesting that it had a continental rather than English origin. Following up on this, Russell Edwards consulted Swiss shawl expert Diane Thalmann, who proposed that the shawl could potentially be of Russian origin. One of the leading textile manufacturers in 19th century Eastern Europe was located in Pavlovsky Posad, just outside Moscow. It has been confirmed that a popular 19th century Russian motif in shawl production included the Michaelmas daisy, which appears on this shawl. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church celebrates Michaelmas, known as St. Michael's Day, on November 8th, the day before the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Interestingly, in England, Michaelmas is celebrated on September 29th, which coincides with the murder of Catherine Eddowes, which happened that night September 29th to 30th. Now, this suggests a potential pattern, leading me to believe that this holiday, Michaelmas, held significance for the killer when he emigrated from Russia to England. Of the suspects, only one fits this circumstantial evidence: Aaron Kosminski, who fled anti-Semitism in Russia and moved to England in 1881, 7 years before the Jack the Ripper murders began. So you're probably starting to realize why I believe Russell Edwards' book is of importance when we look at this case. It's not about the DNA alone. But back to the DNA. Doctors Luchanian and Miller conducted, quote, the most systemic and most advanced genetic analysis to date regarding the Jack the Ripper murders, end quote. They extracted and analyzed mitochondrial DNA from the shawl, and semen was also identified and a DNA profile was developed. The researchers concluded, quote, that all the data collected supports the hypothesis that the shawl contains biological material from Catherine Eddowes, and that the mtDNA sequences obtained from the semen stains match the sequences of one of the main police suspects, Aaron Kosminski, end quote. Now, there is a lot of big buts associated with this research. The identity of Jack the Ripper is not so neatly tied up. And after reading Russell Edwards' book and the peer-reviewed papers by Dr. Luchanian and Miller, I cannot confidently say whether their DNA analysis is exceptional or fundamentally flawed. So once again, I have turned to my science consultant, Dr. Daniel McCracken, the molecular biophysicist who assisted me during Diane Marjorie Moore's book, 16 Minutes. So let me welcome Dr. McCracken back to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast.
Thank you for having me back on.
So Dan, there's been a lot made of the DNA analysis of the DNA found on the shawl related to Jack the Ripper. I've read the papers. I don't get it. Can you please explain?
Yes, I'm happy to. I read through the paper, and I don't have as much of the book and forensics background as you will on this. Having read the paper, I understand there is a bit of a controversy in regards to the results of the paper. And I want to first say that the establishing the identity of Jack the Ripper wasn't ever the purpose of the paper. They wanted to use novel DNA analysis techniques to see if they'll work on old aged DNA. And I think they did show that it's workable. You're able to keep contamination down to a minimum, and you're able to analyze this DNA using the novel methods of the time. Now, keep in mind, that's nearly a decade ago now.
This is true.
More than a decade ago. Sorry.
No, it is. It was back in like 2012, 2013. I think it was published in 2014. So in Russell Edwards' book, he's fairly convinced, though, that this is the DNA of Aaron Kosminski, who is Jack the Ripper, that Catherine Eddowes' blood was on the scarf.
So the paper certainly doesn't say that that's untrue. So let's start with that. The paper doesn't disagree with that analysis. But there's a few things which in the paper could have potentially been done better.
Can you explain a little bit about like types of DNA? And I didn't realize there were types of DNA.
Yeah. So there's typically, for most purposes, there's really two types of DNA. You have the genomic DNA and mitochondrial DNA. Your genomic DNA is what we hear about when we do like 23andMe. This is your 23 chromosomes. And when they're passed down to a child, you have the male DNA, the female DNA, and they recombine. So they mix and match different bits of each other, and you come up with new DNA.
Okay. So when we hear about DNA analysis being done in a crime that took place a month ago, we're dealing with genomic DNA.
Yes, that's how you would identify someone. Versus the mitochondrial DNA, it doesn't organize itself into chromosomes. It's just a circular DNA fragment that gets replicated just like a rolling ball over and over. It has different replication machinery for the DNA than our own genomic DNA. And it's actually less error prone than our genomic DNA. So changes to the mitochondrial DNA over time don't really happen as much. So rather than having recombination playing a factor for changing of the genetics and everything, it just gets replicated over and over.
So it's much more generic.
Much more generic. We organize it into haplotypes. You probably see this on like 23andMe and other
Ancestry,
genetic ancestry, other genetic testing services and things like that. Mitochondrial DNA, we organize into haplotypes. And everyone in this specific haplotype, which is going to be millions and millions of people, is going to show up as this haplotype with very little variation there. And they say right in the paper that the mitochondrial DNA type identified from the shawl would have belonged to over 3 million Londoners at the time. So there's 3 million people in the city that could be a match for this.
Whoa.
All you can do with the mitochondrial DNA is you can exclude certain people. You can't really include people because of the number that you have that mitochondrial DNA.
So then Catherine Eddowes' DNA agrees with the results, but she is one of 3 million possible people whose DNA they analyzed.
Yes, for the mitochondrial DNA, yes. So while it says that it can still be this person, it doesn't definitively point the finger at them.
So this is, in fact, what they're analyzing when they're looking at the DNA fragments that they found on this shawl that supposedly belonged to Jack the Ripper.
It gets more complicated when you start getting into the weeds, but there's no need to do that.
No weeds, okay. No. So it didn't rule out Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski, but it can't definitively identify either one because it's based on mitochondrial. Yes?
Yes.
I got it. I think I got it.
Excellent.
All right.
So there's another facet there also, because they also looked at some chromosomal DNA from some sperm cells that were found on the shawl, the genomic DNA. It was a very low number of them. And they had to replicate this with a whole genomic amplification. Now, when you do whole genome amplification, even today, and even more so a decade ago, you have an issue with those problems of errors in replication happening.
Not a great copy machine then.
It's one of those old copy machines that sometimes it has a little bit too much toner.
Got it. Okay.
Unfortunately, just because the nature of the low amount of DNA that they had and the methods they used without a bevy of controls for the testing that they did, there's kind of a big question mark there about the results of the chromosomal DNA they tested as well.
And that's because of the limited amount of cells. And let's face it, it's over 130-something-year-old DNA.
Yes, it's very easy to, when you're doing this whole genome amplification they performed on it, to expect a number of errors during that amplification. And those are going to get compounded by a technique such as qPCR. qPCR, quantitative polymerase chain reaction. That's what they use to measure the amount of DNA and to actually quantify segments of DNA.
I trust you on that. Thank you so much.
Excellent. That gets to the third problem. And only 3 problems I really saw reading through the paper. And the third problem is they've made the copy of this DNA. And there are certain areas in this DNA which are more error-prone than others. And they're attempting to ID it using specifically those error-prone portions.
Only those error-prone portions?
Only those error-prone portions.
Huh. So there's scientific problems with this, and you really cannot say with certainty that Aaron Kosminski and Catherine Eddowes' DNA was on the shawl.
I'd say determining things for certainty is the job of a judge and jury, not of a scientist.
Oh, boy. Wow. There's a can of worms there.
I'm not a forensic scientist. I'm a biochemist, molecular biophysicist, molecular biologist.
DNA is DNA is DNA. I mean, they might use different tools or have a different setup or something, but if you're testing DNA, this is testing DNA. And the doctors involved in this study were not forensic scientists either, which is why I wanted to have you come in and not, I didn't say to Joseph Scott Morgan, hey, you want to come in and look at this for me?
Yeah.
You know?
So I'd say that it gives a bit more credence to the claims that Jack the Ripper was this individual, but doesn't make an extremely strong case for it. The case for it needs to be assembled from all of the data, not just this one set. It's not cut and dry, but it certainly helps.
Yeah, they didn't do genetic genealogy. It's not what went on here. Does it sound like they did what they could with a 130-year-old small, tiny sample of DNA?
Don't know the condition of the DNA personally, so I can't really say that.
All right. Thank you. It's not a clear no way, this is completely wrong, completely rejected. It's just not it's not absolute.
It's not absolute. There's room for it having been more thorough.
Well, thank you, Dr. McCracken. I absolutely could not have explained this at all. I am very glad that you're here using a lot of analogies to help us.
Excellent. Thank you for having me on.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, there you are. That helped me to understand the complexities of DNA analysis, let alone dealing with 130-year-old DNA. And I hope that makes clear why the DNA analysis remains controversial. It didn't rule out Kosminski or Catherine Eddowes' DNA being on the shawl, which is good, but it also cannot accurately identify the killer. So it only remains possible that Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. But there is more. Yes, more. In 1901, Sir Robert Anderson, who was the Assistant Commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police and head of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department during the Ripper murders, published an article and autobiography. In these writings, he claimed that the identity of Jack the Ripper was, quote, definitely ascertained fact, end quote. Anderson stated that a witness had identified the killer but refused to testify. Well, this witness was Israel Schwartz, who I mentioned before. Anderson described the Ripper as a homicidal maniac who eventually ended up in an asylum. A few years later, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who was also directly involved in the Ripper investigation, obtained a copy of Anderson's book and made notes in the margins, which are now known as marginalia. Swanson identified Anderson's prime suspect as a Polish Jew living in Whitechapel who had the protection of his family. This information was first published in a Daily Telegraph article in 1981. The Swanson marginella revealed that, quote, the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him, but he refused to give evidence against him because the suspect was also a Jew and also because his evidence would convict the suspect and the witness would be the means of the murderer being hanged, which he did not wish to be left on his mind. And after the identification of the suspect, no other murder of this kind took place in London. On the suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by police day and night. In a very short time, the suspect, with hands tied behind his back, was sent to Stepney Workhouse and then to Colony Hatch and died a short time afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect. End quote. Well, fun fact. Dr. Richard Tody, the assistant director of the Home Office Forensic Science Lab, conducted an analysis that determined that the marginalia was written in Swanson's handwriting, a perfect match. By comparing Swanson's marginalia with McNaughton's document and Anderson's autobiography, it becomes evident that Aaron Kosminski is the prime suspect in 1888. But who is Aaron Kosminski? Author Robert House conducted extensive research on Kosminski. In the mid-1980s, an analysis of asylum documents revealed that a man named Kosminski was admitted to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in March 1889. The record indicates that Kosminski was not considered a threat to society. Well, this reminds me of a similar document from Atascadero, a criminal mental health facility in California, which stated that a 21-year-old man was deemed cured and no longer a danger to society after he had murdered his grandparents in his teens. His name was Ed Kemper, the tall, intelligent man who went on to become a serial killer. Also not a danger to society. So Aaron Mordecai Kosminski was born in 1865 to a Polish Jewish family in Russia. His father, Abram, was a tailor, and his mother, Golda Lubnowski, was the daughter of a butcher. Aaron was born when Golda was 45 years old. Aaron had one older brother, Isaac, and 3 sisters, all of whom survived to adulthood. In 1871, Isaac moved to England in search of better opportunities. 3 years later, Abram passed away, leaving Golda to care for their remaining children. At just 10 years old, Aaron began working as a tailor, while his sister Matilda married a bootmaker named Lubnowski. By 1881, Russia was struggling to maintain control over its vast empire, facing dissent and nationalistic uprisings. In this turbulent environment, Jews were often scapegoated, blamed for the unrest. This tension culminated in the assassination of Tsar Alexander II on March 1, 1881. Ironically, he had been a reformer. His successor, Alexander III, was rigid and strict and supported his powerful secret police to the hilt. The subsequent anti-Jewish pogrom triggered a massive wave of immigration as 225,000 Jewish families left the country, with thousands relocating to London. Among them was 15-year-old Aaron Kosminski and his family. The 700-mile journey, which is approximately 1,127 kilometers, was a harrowing experience filled with theft, unscrupulous guards, and a grueling 3-day passage across the North Sea, where immigrants were crammed into the lower levels of the ship. Upon arrival at England's chaotic docks, many immigrants fell victim to thieves. Initially, both Anglicized Jews and native Londoners extended their sympathy to the newcomers. Life in London promised freedoms and opportunities that were far beyond anything they had experienced in Russia. In 1885, temporary shelters were established to welcome impoverished Jews. However, as suspicions grew, this kindness dwindled, leading to a troubling backlash against the Jewish community and a resurgence of anti-Semitism. As a Holocaust and genocide expert, a Mandel Fellow with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and a scholar who studied at Yad Vashem, I firmly believe that anti-Semitism is a harmful manifestation of hatred that must be condemned, and I am using my voice to do so now. All hate is wrong. During his family's reunion, they learned that Isaac had changed his last name from Kosminski to Abrahams, inspiring his siblings to follow suit, although Aaron occasionally still used Kosminski. Eventually, all the siblings lived on Green Street, south of St. Mary Magdalene's Church. In an 1888 survey, the area was described as, quote, being inhabited by a rather superior class of people, with a few fairly well off, end quote. The Kosminski-Abrahams family faced significant challenges as they sought to establish themselves in England. Isaac had become a successful ladies' tailor, subcontracting for a manufacturer during the booming English tailor industry of the 1870s. However, tensions rose due to this influx of Jewish immigration. Unionization efforts increased, leading to strikes and a growing wave of anti-Semitism affecting all Jews, including both native Britons and the immigrants. This hostile environment likely had a profound impact on teenage Aaron Kosminski, potentially fueling, quote, the intense anger and hatred that gave rise to a serial killer, end quote, as noted by author Robert House. Research indicates that an unstable social environment can shape a child's perception of unfair treatment, particularly for those fleeing persecution, only to encounter something similar in their new country. Alas, historical documentation on Aaron Kosminski is limited. He is listed as a hairdresser, essentially a barber, and was also trained in surgery, which made me gasp. In 1879, he was arrested for failing to muzzle his dog. He was later described as a pauper lunatic exhibiting signs of insanity at age 25, which is when schizophrenia often presents in males. So as I mentioned, schizophrenia is a serious chronic mental disorder that involves confusing thinking, altered perceptions of reality, hallucination, delusions, and paranoia. So in 1881, while staying with various siblings, Aaron was admitted to the workhouse with his hands tied behind his back due to his manic state. Mania is characterized by an abnormally elevated or irritable mood, accompanied by increased energy and frenetic behavior. Dr. Edmund King Houchin examined Aaron, who indicated he only ate food found in the gutter, that he had threatened his sister with a knife, and claimed to be controlled by an instinct that allowed him to perceive the movements of all humanity. Yeah. Aaron was diagnosed as being of unsound mind, and it was recommended that he be detained for care. So Aaron Kosminski, patient number 11,190, was transferred to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum during a time when mental illness was just beginning to be recognized as a brain disorder rather than a consequence of supernatural causes. Treatment methods of the period were often harsh, involving restraints and cages, primarily to relieve the burden of families. In severe cases, doctors experimented with chloral hydrate and later hosamine, a toxin derived from mandrake and jimson weed. These substances had a powerful sedative hypno effect, similar to knockout drops, which were used to manage violent and homicidal patients. But unfortunately, this approach often functioned more as a punishment than a cure, as it was intended to, quote, curb maniacal excitement and induce a state of stupefaction in patients, end quote. In 1894, Aaron was transferred to Leavesden Asylum for Imbeciles, where most of his records were lost. By 1910, he was suffering from secondary dementia and hallucinations, which made him unable to answer questions. His health declined in 1916, and he passed away on March 24, 1919, at age 53. He was buried by his brothers, Isaac and Wolf Abrahams, in a Jewish cemetery in East Ham, while the rest of the Kosminski family were buried together in an East London cemetery, which I found odd. Why didn't they want him with the family? Did they know something ominous? Now, back to that cryptic message that was left on the brick wall when Catherine Eddowes was killed. Do you remember? It said, quote, the Jews, spelled Juwes, are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, end quote. This has been subject to endless speculation about its meaning. While researching his book, Russell Edwards received a Kosminski family photograph of Isaac Abrahams, dressed in Freemason robes. He later confirmed that Isaac became a Freemason in 1884. The mysterious Freemasons are a worldwide secret society of men devoted to fellowship, moral discipline, and cooperation, complete with rituals that only fellow Masons are permitted to know. So this gives some credence to the theory that this influence was used to keep Aaron Kosminski in an asylum instead of being arrested and prosecuted at the time. Now, the secret Masonic code also provides some insight, and this story goes back to King Solomon. Back in antiquity, 3 traitors were working on King Solomon's temple, murdering its architect and master mason, Hiram Abiff. Known as the 3 Jews, spelled Juwes, they were Jubela, Jubelo, and Jubelum. Tradition tells us that the 3 were tortured to death as their punishment, which now serves as the 3 Mason blood oaths. Physically descriptive, the first describes how Hiram Abiff was slain: throat cut, tongue torn out, body buried in the sand. The second oath refers to the left breast being torn open, the heart and vitals taken and thrown over the left shoulder. And the third references severing the body in 2 in the middle, bowels burnt to ashes, and ashes scattered to the 4 winds of heaven. Both John Douglas and Russell Edwards point out that these descriptions provide us with Jack the Ripper's modus operandi for 4 of his victims, him being interrupted before he could inflict his will fully on Elizabeth Stride. All 5 had their throats slashed as described in the first blood oath. Annie Chapman, Kate Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were mutilated in the realistic manner described. The third blood oath reads, "My bowels burnt to ashes in the center," which roughly aligns with the evisceration of Mary Jane Kelly. The word Juwes, written on the brick wall, directly ties this cryptic message to the Freemasons. The question arises, was Sir Charles Warren, the Chief Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, who had the message erased, a Freemason acting to prevent the secret society from being exposed? Could this be the reason that Aaron Kosminski was confined rather than arrested, due possibly to his brother Isaac's Masonic influence? We may never know the truth. Assistant Police Commissioner Robert Anderson wrote in that 1910 biography, quote, "It sometimes happens that the murder is known, but the evidence is wholly wanting. One did not need to be Sherlock Holmes to discover that the criminal was a sex maniac of a virulent type, that he was living in the immediate vicinity of the scenes of the murders, and that, if he was not living absolutely alone, his people knew of his guilt and refused to give him up to justice. The police had made a house-to-house search for him, investigating the case of every man in the district whose circumstances were such that he could come and go and get rid of his bloodstains in secret. The conclusion we came to was that he and his people were low-class Jews. I should almost be tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit will result from such a course. I will only add that when the individual whom we suspected was caged in an asylum, the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer at once identified him, and when he learned that the suspect was a fellow Jew, he declined to swear to him." End quote. So, looking at all of this evidence, the writings by investigators on the case, the profiles done by the FBI's BAU, the analysis of the origins of the shawl, the DNA analysis, Aaron Kosminski's background, I believe that Aaron Kosminski is, in all likelihood, Jack the Ripper, who murdered Mary Ann Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. I know there will be many who disagree, but I've presented the arguments that have led me to this conclusion. As always, trust your gut. Thank you for listening to my trilogy, and I am excited to announce our next book, A Dark Night in Aurora, Inside James Holmes and the Colorado Mass Shooting by Dr. William H. Reed, selected by my Patreon murder bookies. On July 20th, 2012, James Holmes attacked a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, killing or injuring 70 people. He was found waiting by his car and detained without resistance. Dr. Reed is the only person allowed to conduct extensive interviews with Holmes, who analyzed Holmes's diary, phone records, and spoke with his family and victims. I'll also reference Aurora, the psychiatrist who treated the movie theater killer tells her story by Dr. Lynn Fenton, who treated Holmes before the attack. Don't miss this, murder bookies. Join me in 2 weeks when my next episode drops. And don't forget, I'll be on Creators Row at CrimeCon 2025, September 5th to 7th. If you need your badge, you save 10% with my code. I know. One word, all lowercase letters, Murder Shelf. So bring me to the beach or the pool or the mountains as you enjoy the summer weather. My sources, crime scene photos, map, recipe, and drink selections are found on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, July 2025. Contact me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or find me on X, Facebook, Instagram, and I'm on YouTube as well. See you in 2 weeks, murder bookies. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.